It's my honor to introduce Treaty Commissioner Jamie Wilson to speak about treaties and City of Winnipeg, relating to City of Winnipeg today. Jamie Wilson is from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. He has a master's degree in educational administration. He was an elite special operations ranger and was appointed as commissioner of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba in 2010. The commission is a neutral body mandated to encourage discussion, facilitate public understanding, and enhance mutual respect between peoples in Manitoba on the First Nations treaties. He moves with equal ease in both the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities and is known for pushing himself both physically and mentally. He doesn't easily settle for second best. As an athlete, he does not just run, he's a triathlete and a CrossFit competitor. I'm in CrossFit training, and let me tell you, it's pretty intense. On ancestral lands, he is an award-winning environmentalist and survivalist who teaches the traditional ways of the land, navigation, and subsistence living. He also serves on the Indigenous Advisory Circle at the University of Winnipeg, which oversees the Masters in Indigenous Development. He is a counselor on the Canadian Education Association and is a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for Community Service. Jamie is married to Kristen Erickson, and together they have 3 school-aged children. It's my pleasure to introduce Treaty Commissioner James Wilson. Oh, and 1 grandson, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. You guys can hear me okay? Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon. I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief because I'd like to get more into a dialogue. I think it's a really good opportunity to be able to sit here, or for you to sit here, I guess, for me to stand here, and dialogue with a group such as yours that is really has had an impact in the city and is pushing to make some really substantial changes. I sat in the back listening to the report and all that stuff, and it's really awe-inspiring for me. Have somebody that's moved from northern Manitoba. I've been kind of insular in the education community for a while. To be exposed to a group like this, it's really heartening to see everything that you're doing. So firstly, I wanted to thank all of you for all the contributions that you have made. Now, real quickly, the mandate of our office, the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, is to re-strengthen and rebuild the treaty relationship. So getting away from the Indian Act being the piece of legislation that brought in residential schools, the pass system, that outlawed ceremonies, that made it illegal for lawyers in Canada to represent First Nations. Getting away from that document and going back to the treaty relationship, where we had equal partners sitting around a table, talking and dialoguing about how we could support each other, how we could work with each other to build a future basically for all of us. So in my comments, because of my role, so I report dually to both the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the federal government. So as we're an independent body, I'll try to give, in everything that I do, I'll try to give both perspectives. So giving context to some of these issues that are facing us in the city right now. And then there may be some subtext. I'll leave it up to you to fill in the blanks of the subtext, I guess. Now, one of the bigger issues that's facing us in Winnipeg right now is what many people would term urban reserves. Now, the urban reserves, or what a lot of First Nations are calling First Nations economic development zones, have been around in Canada for quite some time. They're very new to Manitoba, though. It's a very new dialogue that we're having here in the province. Saskatchewan, they've had urban reserves, economic development zones for over 20 years now. Partnerships between the City of Saskatoon and Muskeg Lake Cree Nation began years and years ago. There's 50 urban reserves that have been developed across Saskatchewan. We have urban reserves that have been developed in British Columbia, East Coast, all over the place. Now, in Manitoba, there was until just recently one urban reserve in Manitoba. Just recently, now there's two very small pieces of property. Now I have, and the bigger piece of property that when you talk about urban reserves or First Nations economic development zones that everybody in Winnipeg and Manitoba wants to know about is Kapyong Barracks. And I can't speak specifically about Kapyong, but I'm going to share some insights into the success stories that have happened elsewhere, and I'll leave it up to you to infer what can or should happen at Kapyong Barracks. As one example. Now, in Saskatchewan, as I was saying, there's 50 economic development zones, urban reserves all across the province. The first one was, again, in Saskatoon, a partnership between Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and the City of Saskatoon, the municipality of Saskatoon. Now, if you talk about urban reserves in Manitoba, your average person, and I've witnessed this because I do a lot of talking, right away there's a whole bunch of stereotypes and preconceptions that pop up. An example would be, I have a cousin that works in the media, and when the story first broke about Kapyong, the more recent iteration of the story broke about Kapyong, I believe it was around October. She was sent out by her news agency to interview people in tuxedo with specific directions to get people saying something racist on camera. It was easy, she said. People were willing to say things that they would never, ever otherwise say. And it was quite shocking for those of us that work in the First Nations community, in education, in trying to build bridges between the First Nations community and other communities in Winnipeg and Manitoba. It was quite shocking to see that kind of glaring prejudice, I guess. So one of the things that we have to do is to start educating people. Because right away, when you said urban reserves, everyone thought of, okay, there's going to be overturned cars, shanty housing, lack of running water, crime rates are going to go up. All of these things just came spewing out, right? Property levels adjacent are going to go down. Now, we're lucky in that in Winnipeg, we've got other communities that have gone through this that we can draw lessons from. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about Saskatoon. So Saskatoon, when they started developing a piece of property, what happened, and this is happening with a lot of the economic development zones, and I'm going to use First Nations economic development zones and urban reserves kind of interchangeably. First Nations have, through treaty negotiations, through unjust dealings with the government in the past, have certain land allocations that are owed to them. Now, depending on where you are in Canada, there's different ways that First Nations can access that land. They can either apply for Crown land, or they can just simply purchase the land, willing buyer, willing seller, and transfer that land to reserve status. In Saskatchewan, the treaty land entitlement process, through I guess promises that were not delivered through the treaties, which worked their way through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court told the government of Canada, okay, you have to honor these promises that were made. There is a whole number of First Nations that were owed land. So in the Saskatchewan model, they were given money to acquire pieces of land. So Muskeg Lake Cree Nation approaches the city of Saskatoon and says, we would like to buy this piece of land. And the dialogue started. Now they were the city of Saskatoon was very progressive in how they handled this, because one of the first things they did is they started educating the constituents around that property. So they sent out flyers, they had town hall meetings, and they started building a dialogue. They were very, very aggressive in how they started educating people. Now, Muskeg Lake Cree Nation starts this piece of property. How many of you in Winnipeg have ever been to Saskatoon and seen the? There's quite a few of you actually. Okay. Now, if you go there today, you'll see there's gas stations there. There's a strip mall, office complex. There's been 400 jobs have been created through this development. And it's really been a success story that has allowed the residents of Saskatoon and elsewhere to say, okay, this is something that can work. And that model has expanded both within the city of Saskatoon. There's different pockets of reserve land now all throughout the city of Saskatoon and all over the province. Now, I think here in Manitoba, we're a long way away from kind of achieving that true partnership, but the dialogue is starting. And I think it's really critical that groups such as yourselves get involved in the dialogue as it's starting, because there's a real opportunity to shape what some of these, what these communities will look like, I guess. Now, some of the issues that were dealt with in Saskatoon, things such as property taxes, the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and the municipality came up with agreements. They said, okay, we have service agreements. So anything that piece of property, whatever the city of Saskatoon loses because it becomes reserved land, they are regaining through this service agreement they have with the First Nation. They have policing agreements, they have water, sewer agreements, all of the normal services that a piece of property in a municipality would receive through the agreements between the municipality and the First Nation. They've have been part of that negotiation. So here in Manitoba, we've got a whole bunch of properties, a whole bunch of First Nations that are owed land all throughout the province. My First Nation alone, Pasquet Cree Nation, through unfulfilled obligations that the federal government had and has, we are owed 16,000 acres of land. So the process is a lot longer in Manitoba. To convert a piece of property from either Crown land or private land to reserve takes right now anywhere between 5 to 8 years. It's a really, really long process. One of the groups that's working to kind of help speed up the process, I mean, the First Nations have been pushing to speed up the process for years, but there's a new partner that's kind of stepped forward and said, we want to help speed up the process, and that's the Association of Manitoba Municipalities, who have stepped forward and said, we're being left out of this dialogue, and we need to be a partner in this dialogue right from the beginning. So our office is coordinating a series of discussions and panels with the AMM to talk about how we can speed up the 8-year process, and how we can strengthen the relationships between municipalities and First Nations. Because if you look at a community like the Paw, where I'm from, or Opaskwayak Cree Nation, so if you're not familiar, there's the town of the Paw on the south side of the river, Opaskwayak Cree Nation on the north side of the river. Now, years ago, the reserve was actually on the south side of the river, but the Indian agent was also the mayor of the Paw, and the reserve, through parcels, a whole bunch of individual parcels of land, was eventually moved to the other side of the reserve. So the Paw is very unique in that it's completely surrounded by reserve, and there's pockets of reserve land scattered all through the community. Many in OCN would in fact argue that all the roadways, back alleys are still part of OCN because it was only the lots that were transferred. Yes. So if community like ours, Northern Manitoba, we've had a real history that, I mean, it hasn't been a very positive history. Like, I remember when we used to travel and you'd introduce yourselves as being from Opaskwayak Cree Nation or the Paw, and people would right away say, well, conspiracy is silence. You're that community that Helen Betty Osborne was from, or not from, but where she was murdered. And everybody in the town knew about it. and nothing ever happened. I mean, the racism between the two communities was public knowledge internationally, I think. But one of the things that forced us to do is people in our communities could not say, oh, there's no racism here. We had to face that racism that was happening between the two communities. So there's a number of community leaders that stepped up and started educating each other. The municipality and the chief and council started working together. Years ago, when the Pasquet Cree Nation opened a shopping mall, this was the early 70s, all the business leaders in the town of the Pas started a petition against it. They thought it would harm their business. They thought OCN would have an unfair advantage. They tried everything they could to stop that development. Through a real concerted education effort, they started working together, and the two communities both realized, okay, development in this area will help development in the other area, and vice versa. And that's really what we're starting to see now in the dialogue between First Nations and municipalities in Manitoba. And I think it's critical at this stage for us to be asking some really important questions. Like, if we have a significant piece of property, a very valuable piece of property, and it's developed, how do we include affordable housing into that development? How do we include green space into that development? So it's got, those questions I think have to be pushed forward now. I think they have to be, they have to be raised now. And the partnerships and the dialogue between the two groups has to be really strongly encouraged.